Hello, readers in the Read podcast universe. Welcome to Read, the research, education, advocacy podcast. I'm Danielle Gomez, and I am so glad that you are here. Read is produced by the Windward Institute. And honestly, it has been such an amazing journey getting to learn alongside you these past 5 years. Since Read launched in 2020, this podcast has been a space to explore some of the most important conversations happening in education, especially when it comes to reading. And at the heart of it all, one simple, maybe not so simple, but more a powerful goal: literacy for all. As you know, Read's typical format is one monthly interview featuring one expert, and I have learned so much. I just want to give a special shout out and gratitude to all of our expert guests who have joined us over the past 5 years. We have examined reading research through the lens of leaders as well in our quarterly Lead on Read series, co-hosted by Windward's head of school and the WI's executive director, Jamie Williamson. Shout out to my podcast bestie over there. After a summer break, we know the work isn't done, and there's so much more to do, so much more to learn. And that's why this episode launches a special series on the Read podcast with a new format focused on one topic: reading. These episodes this October are part of a series called What We Can All Learn About Reading Together. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most fascinating topics I've ever encountered: the reading brain, how it develops, and why it matters for every single one of us. Yes, every human. Okay, so let's start with a little thought experiment. I want you to just picture yourself as a reader, right? You're listening to my voice, but you're actually reading something. Maybe you're sipping your morning coffee while reading the news, scrolling through an article on your phone, or you're like me, curled up on a really good book. Maybe you're in front of a beach or a fireplace. It might seem like when reading clicks, it just feels effortless, right? But here's the twist. Reading isn't natural. Unlike speaking or listening to oral language, which we're wired to do, reading is something that our brains have to be taught. We literally have to train our brains to read. And that transformation, it's backed by decades of research, and truthfully, it's absolutely mind-blowing. So today, we're exploring science behind how reading develops, what happens in our brains, how it changes over time, and what this means for kids, for caregivers, teachers, and truthfully, all of us as humans. So let's kick things off with Dr. Joanna Christodoulou, the director of the Brain Education and Mind Lab and a professor at the Windward Institute for Professions. She's going to break down what's happening in the brain when we learn to read. Let's listen in. Hello, readers in the Read universe. Welcome to the Read podcast. I am here with our first expert of our series in the fall with Dr. Joanna Christodoulou. Dr. Christodoulou, welcome to Read.
Thank you so much for having me. So happy to be here.
I am just like, the joy and the gratitude is all here. I'm just filled with it. I want to start with just this podcast, and this podcast being, we're learning about reading together. And the goal of this really is to understand the journey of the reading brain, then to really dive into why some kids might struggle, and then explore what those implications would be in our classrooms, in our schools, our communities. And so the question I have for you is a really important one, really setting the charge for our next 20 experts. And as an educator, I always felt really empowered to know about the reading brain and to really then apply it to my classroom. And there are some readers that may already know about our reading brain, and I'm excited. I know I feel like I'm building this up. That are excited about this, and what you're about to tell us is really validating for them. And then there are some listeners that are new. And that is I think maybe even more exciting, because this might be the first time they're hearing this. And so my question for you to start us off is, what does the research say about our reading brain? When we say our reading brain, what is it? And can you just explain, for the stakeholders that are listening, our readers, what is it? And what does it mean for our children that are in our classrooms?
This is so exciting to talk about with you. And so to just set the stage here, every child or adult, or whenever literacy acquisition is possible for someone, is doing one of the most incredible feats of the human brain, which is orchestrating different parts of the brain that have primary purposes for vision, auditory processing, language, motor skills, cognitive skills, among others, and finding a way to have them work in coordination in service of making squiggles on the page make meaning for them and relating it to themselves, their experiences, and their history. So that as a headline is just the most important thing to emphasize, especially for anyone who has any role in sitting down with a book for themselves or with a developing reader, because as one of the best gifts you can offer someone is empowering them to become a reader. And that is a process. That process requires a lot of purposeful practice. And when we I'll pivot between terms we use in education and in neuroscience. So we talk about practice and experience and instruction and exposure. And then in the neuroscience world, there's one word that captures a lot of that. And that word is plasticity. When we say brain plasticity, what we're referring to is how the brain changes, brain structure and function, how they are modified in response to purposeful, sustained, meaningful experiences. And so to become a reader, we are capitalizing on this incredible property of the brain, which is its capacity to change in response to the environment and what is important in the environment for us to pay attention to and to process. So my first answer here is just really putting the spotlight on the brain is plastic throughout our lives. If we become to literacy when we're going through our typical development through education, whether it's coming through adult literacy or anywhere in between, it is the capacity to reorganize your brain in service of understanding print and in a language that's familiar to the society that we live in. All of that is benefiting from something really incredible, which is we spend the first 5 years of our lives establishing a foundation of oral language. So we can hear someone and speak and use syntax and grammar and meaning and phonology and all these aspects of language that set the foundation for us to then start our formal reading instruction and add on the layer of translating squiggles on a page, which the fancy word for it is orthography, figure out how the system of language that we have in print mode matches to the sounds of that specific language that we've been training our brain for all that time before school even starts. So that's my first answer.
Gosh, so I love that because disencapsulated that I know like in the ethosphere and popular media, maybe even researchers have said we were never born to read, right? And so that kind of speaks to that element of having those language pieces, but that the brain's plasticity, it must change in order to actually match the sounds with the squiggles on the page. I love that. I think my follow-up question then would be, as an educator, it's pretty mind-blowing to learn that for the first time. I mean, not to say that I was in school, like learning from my teachers that the reading brain had to be, developed. But as an educator, when I first learned it, I was like, whoa, I had no idea. So yeah, why is it so mind-blowing to people outside of neuroscience that haven't seen this?
Well, it's mind-blowing in the field of neuroscience too. Every time we do a brain scan with a child and see their brain pop up on the screen, it never loses the incredible surprise of like, this is the part of this person that makes them themselves. And here it is. And we can show it to them and they can kind of see inside the way in which their system is organized. But I'll say a couple more things about that. Part of what's amazing is when you're an educator learning about the reading brain, I think it's empowering because you, as the educator, are one of the main agents of that brain plasticity. It doesn't happen in the absence of your actions. So everything an educator or a parent or whoever plays these roles in fostering literacy skills is playing, they are the agents of change in facilitating how the brain is learning how it should process information that's important to exist in the society that we have. So I think that is a really important way to reframe and add on to the responsibilities and privileges of being in the education world. And I think that is something that educators should own and carry with them and realize that every action that you are bringing to the classroom setting or the learning setting is capitalizing on this incredible feat of training the brain to be able to perceive how should I put my effort toward what's important in the world that I live in. And not only that, the reason that the reading brain has to get trained is because, as you mentioned, we are born with this capacity for language that's elicited through our language partners and babbling phases and training our brain to listen to the sounds that we are exposed to and then kind of honing in on those. But that doesn't mean we are going to be a reader by default. Reading is not a default like language is. Instead, reading requires very purposeful exposure because of the brain. Now, the brain in the back is where the visual system is primarily housed. The visual network is primarily housed in the back. Part of that visual system is perceiving very low-level things like dark or light or different corners and that sort of thing. But then it does have regions that are specialized for stimuli or items in our world that are really important. So one great example is that when you're born, your visual system already has a part of that visual system that's tailored to perceive faces. And that's because faces are one of the most important symbols in our experiences. We can't exist without perceiving and engaging with other faces. And so that is built into our infrastructure. Reading isn't, because we invented that as a community and we've carried it forward as an inheritance in our cultural societies. So what we have to do instead for reading to be part of our repertoire is to actually take the visual system and request that part of it is allocated to perceiving print. And so that has to be a process that takes years to kind of ask the brain, because of this overexposure to print and the meaningfulness that you're taking through its link to print, the sound print relationship, and then of course to meaning. And over and over, that exposure is saying to the visual system, this is important information. We have to have a way of doing this quickly. So in the visual system, as we are becoming more automatic with recognizing different aspects of print, we are housing it in a part of the brain that has a few names. One of the names is the visual word form area. And that name is just really capturing for us that we have to train a part of our visual system to be dedicated to processing print in order for the reading brain to work. And that part of the brain is then linked up to many other networks that we mentioned earlier that cover cognition and language and motor and auditory and all sorts of other processing. So that's part of where the amazingness is of it, to realize that in everyday experiences in the literacy realm, you are building up the visual word form area's expertise, and you are building the repertoire of its word bank as children become more fluent and automatic with that piece.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I just felt like I went on a journey of emotions. I was empowered. I was just validated. I was charged with this responsibility. Oh my gosh. First of all, Dr. Christodoulou, thank you so much for offering your expertise. I will say the second thing is that readers, you are in for such a journey. Starting with this first expert, leading into our 20 experts, there's just so much more that we need to unpack about the reading brain. But I feel this sense of empowerment, responsibility. Thank you again, Dr. Christodoulou. I really appreciate you joining the Read podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's pause for a moment and unpack some of these key ideas. From birth, our brains are wired for spoken language. Okay, so we know that. We have these powerful neural connections that help us communicate, even before we say our first words. But when it comes to reading, that's a whole different story. We aren't born with a reading circuit. Instead, we have to build it through instruction and experience. So next up is Dr. Nicole Landi, professor and director of developmental psychology at the University of Connecticut. She's actually the director of the Landi Lab. So you might remember her from episode 6 of Read. She shared so many insights on the intersection of neuroscience and education. Here, she continues the conversation about what the research tells us about the reading brain and what this means for children who have difficulty, like children with dyslexia. Let's tune in to Dr. Landi. So we are learning about the development of the reading brain and diving in further about the neuroscience. And I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Nicole Landi, the director of the Landi Lab and professor at UConn, also at the Haskins Global Literacy Hub at Yale and UConn. And I know we talked about Plow in the intro, but I just have to say, welcome back, Dr. Landi, to the Read podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Danielle. It's fun to be here again.
I know. Well, I learned so much from you already about this topic that I'm going to ask you about. But for our Read listeners, we're diving into the reading brain, and I would like to know what the neuroscience tells us about the reading brain, and specifically what it tells us about why some kids struggle to learn to read.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot to know, right? So, there's been, quite a lot of research on this topic now, right? So, it's one of those things that I think we'll be revisiting for a long time as we continue to figure it out. But first of all, when we think about like the neurobiology kind of broadly of reading and dyslexia, right, it's important to note that we're talking about something that's highly heritable. But also, I think it's important to note that there are no specific reading genes, right? And so what we've got is this a genetic basis that is highly distributed, right? So likely to involve numerous genes, gene by gene and gene by environment interactions. And the most recent research suggests that the genetic basis of reading and dyslexia, because those are, not distinct, right, likely involves regulatory mechanisms, right? And so I think we'll be hearing a lot more about that as people learn more, and that's, a very fast evolving area.
Can I just pause? What do you mean by regulatory mechanisms? So, and just to give some context, like a lot of our listeners might be new to learning about the neuroscience.
Of course.
Yeah, can you?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So when we talk about the genetic code, right, we have sort of the structural DNA, right? And so when we talk about the human genome, for example, that's the kind of the structure that's been decoded. Right. And there are a lot of genes that we, know about their function, like we know their protein coding, for example, and we kind of know what they do. And there are a lot of other genes where we know kind of much less about them. They were once termed, junk DNA. And we now know that those play a huge role in basically how the genes get read out, right? What they actually do and when they actually do it. And we think that a lot of the elements of the piece of the genetic code that's involved in reading is governed by those mechanisms, and we simply know less about them. And so that's something that we'll learn more about as time goes on.
That's really interesting. And so would you say that the genetic code then contributes to the way that the brain changes as we are learning to read?
Yeah, right. And so that's exactly right. And so the genetic code contributes to how our brain is formed for all of us, right? And then also our response to the environment, right? So that is us learning to read, whether it's, with our parents, in school, et cetera, all of those things. It contributes to all of it.
It's really interesting. And so when you look at then the brains of children who struggle, let's say a child with dyslexia, versus I know the neuroscience, the research says like a typical brain, but a child without dyslexia, what does that look like in comparison?
Yeah. Well, luckily we now have, decades of cognitive neuroscience research that has used magnetic resonance imaging, much of it, or electroencephalography, that's EEG, to tell us about the neurobiology of reading and of dyslexia, right? So we actually know quite a lot about, right? So in terms of brain structure and function, right, we now have substantial evidence from infants at family risk, young children at risk or who struggle with reading, and older children and adults who struggle with reading and or have a diagnosis of dyslexia, right? And these studies show that there are neural signatures of impaired reading and that some of these actually predate, right, learning to read. And these signatures are evident in both structure and in function. So when I talk about structure, we're talking about the anatomy. So that's going to be, gray matter, cortex, as well as white matter, right? The long myelinated axons that connect regions of cortex. as well as in function, right? So that's going to be like the amount of activation or blood flow, which is our indirect measure of neural activity that we get from MRI, for example, right? So we're going to see differences in all of those things, right? For all of those groups that I talk about, right? The most commonly implicated regions and tracts are those in the left hemisphere that are implicated in phonological processing, orthographic processing, or in the conversion of phonology to orthography, right? So processing letters, processing sounds, and linking letters and sounds. Now, if we look beyond dyslexia at the broader kind of reading and language difficulties literature, that network is going to expand to involve regions that have been implicated in more general language and executive functions. So things like grammatical processing and semantics, right? And so then we're going to start to see differences in those regions, right? When we talk about comparing groups of readers, say, poor comprehenders or kids with developmental language disorder to, quote unquote, typical readers, right? So we actually know quite a lot about both the structure and the function, right, of differences between good and poor readers, both those who are dyslexic, and if we broaden that umbrella to include individuals with more, general language impairments or reading comprehension impairments, right? And we know that some of these dyslexia signatures, right? So, for example, the reduced integrity of the arcuate fasciculus, which is, a key white matter tract in the left hemisphere, that predates reading onset, right? So you can already see that there's less integrity in that structure for infants and young children who have a family history of reading disability or dyslexia and who will go on to struggle. Right. So this is something that is clearly neurobiologically based and that predates reading onset or the instruction of reading.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate you kind of walking us through that. I always have this deep dive lesson in neuroscience from you, but I really like the way that you shared that because when you said the neurobiological signature, this actually occurs prior to a child even entering kindergarten, and then B. I appreciate how you walked through the structures of the brain that translates to different behaviors because, obviously as a teacher, you can't open up a child's brain and see where all the networks and connections are happening, but you can see those behaviors that are translating. And so it's validating, I would just say, yeah, it's validating to know that these are the things that are happening underlying in the brain. And so that we could really then translate those methods that are going to change the way that the brain works and hopefully help to mitigate some of those struggles that are happening actually in the child's brain.
Yep, that's right. And I mean, I think it's important that you point out this key link between brain and behavior, right? And most of, what we see at the neurobiological level is confirming, right? A lot of what we see in behavior, right? Like I said, we see for dyslexic kids where their problems tend to be right in the phonological domain of language or in the conversion from, the letters to the sounds, right? That's where we see a lot of the differences, right, in the network differences between individuals with dyslexia and typically developing individuals. And again, when you broaden it out to broader impairments, you see broader impairments at the neurobiological level. And also what I want to point out here is that I don't want anyone to think like that the right hemisphere isn't involved at all, or that these are the only regions that are involved in reading and language, right? It is very much, a whole brain activity. It certainly involves, structures on the right and structures on the left, but we isolate these differences through subtractive designs, right? So we're having kids say in the scanner, if we're doing an EEG scan, we are actually, using tasks to try to isolate these kinds of processes and see where the largest differences are, right? So it's not that those other regions, networks aren't involved in reading, right? Reading is a very intense and difficult thing to acquire, actually. As adults, it's hard for us to remember that. But we're doing something that in some ways we haven't evolved to do, right? We're kind of using these language networks and visual processing networks to be able to read, right? And so that involves a fair amount of, right, plasticity. I think you mentioned plasticity while we were talking before this session, right? And so it's bringing those regions to do this stuff, right? And so when I talk about any specific regions, we're talking about those that are kind of most isolated or implicated during certain kinds of tasks, right? Like reading or like phonological awareness tasks, where we see the greatest differences for, say, kids with dyslexia relative to typically developing peers.
Yeah. Oh, I would learn so much from you. Dr. Landi, thank you so much for offering your expertise on this episode of the Read podcast.
You are most welcome. Thanks again for having me.
Okay, key bookmarks. Dr. Landi shares something else that science shows us. There is a lot of variability in how our brains develop. For reading, some kids pick up this skill quickly. Others need more time. They might need more support, or even, when we'll dive into this, an increased intensity of instruction. We'll go deeper into that in episode 2, but I want to plant that seed here. As adults, parents, educators, any adult human supporting a child, we play a huge role in shaping the reading brain. The ways we talk to children, the ways that we read with them and support their language, all leave an imprint on how their brains develop. So how does this development unfold over time? I'm so excited for this. So let's talk about one of the research greats, Dr. Jean Shaw. She was a pioneer at Harvard who laid the foundation of how we understand reading development today. She also conducted early research comparing phonics to whole language instruction and found that systematic phonics was especially effective for beginning readers. She truly was ahead of her time. To help us unpack her legacy and the decades of research that followed, I am so lucky to be joined by Alexis Pokna, who is the director of the Windward Institute and a longtime teacher, administrator, an expert in reading development and instruction. I always learn so much from Alexis. Let's tune in. Alexis, welcome to Read.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez.
It is, let me tell you this is a long time coming. I was dreaming for weeks about this moment. And so I'd like to ask you a question, but before we do that, you are the director of the Windward Institute, and you are both an expert and a student of all things reading research. And truthfully, you've been at the helm of the WI, leading our commitment to connecting research to practice. And we previously on this episode had Dr. Nicole Landi and Dr. Joanna Christodoulou, who explained the inner workings of the reading brain. And I'd like to know how that translates to maybe like a child's behavior. I mean, you've been a teacher for a really long time. You've been an administrator, and now you're obviously at the WI. And so you've seen countless students learning to read. And so actually, before I get into this question, I just want to pause because you are a Dr. Jean Shaw superfan. And so I know you're going to cite Dr. Shaw. She was a pioneer in both researching and communicating the stages of reading development. I love how you have the book. So I think for this question, many people wanting to know, perhaps you can share the research from Dr. Shaw or from the contributions of others answering this question. What does the research say about the stages of reading development as children age?
Great. Well, I would love to answer that question. And yes, I will be citing Dr. Shaw because she was a true pioneer in the science of reading. And, you know, the work that's come since has just continued to reaffirm many of the points that she made at a time that it was really quite controversial to make them. So really, we know the areas of the brain that are involved in reading. And I think that what I'll be addressing now is sort of the developmental stages of reading, and that we know that it's a continuum. Mm-hmm. That actually, I mean, one of the reasons there are other stages of reading development, but one reason I like to cite Dr. Shaw is because her developmental stages span a lifetime, right? So it starts with, infancy and goes through college into adulthood. The stages follow a predictable trajectory, but they're really not rigid, right? So they depend on many variables. Obviously, there are many variables involved in children learning how to read. Some students will have more difficulty than others. Some students might be learning to read in multiple languages, for example. Some students might be at risk for reading difficulties for a variety of reasons that could be impacting their academic experience. There's also different types of text involved in developmental stages. So, a quick read that I pick up for the beach, I might be able to breeze through, but if I need to pick up a physics textbook and quickly learn something about, I don't even know, I might be struggling with some of the decoding and a lot of the vocabulary. So there is fluidity to the stages, but they do give us a nice window into the developmental progression of reading. So when we look at Dr. Schall's stages, they really start really at stage 0, which is very early childhood, preschool age, when children, for all of us out there who've had the experience of interacting with young children, they pretend how to read. They learn how to hold a book. They learn how to hold a pencil and paper, and they start to go through those early literacy motions. They might recognize some signage. They might recognize their name. And then they move into stage 1, which typically aligns with more formal reading instruction around first grade. And that's when children begin to see the relationship, right, between print letters and the sounds that they make. And they start understanding how to decode and make sense of that relationship, which then progresses to increased automaticity and fluency. So that will come after the initial introduction of formal reading, after students have really read, controlled passages, and they start to develop automaticity and fluency, which really is the gateway to start making more meaning out of the text that they're reading. And that typically, we're thinking that's around second or third grade. Then as you move into upper elementary and middle school, you enter into what has famously been coined, right, the reading to learn stage. So you start with 0 to 2, and that's learning to read, and then you move into 3 to 5, stages 3 to 5, which is reading to learn. There are some critics of that because of sort of this polarity that it seemingly creates, which it's really not intended to do that. I mean, it's really just sort of a conceptual framework to think again about this continuum. So as students enter, the reading to learn stage, they're reading for information, right? They're getting information out of books. They're getting story out of books. They're learning about the world through books. And then children move into the later stage, which typically is going to start around high school. But, again, these are really flexible. It certainly could happen, in middle school as well. But this is when children really start to read and understand multiple viewpoints through text. So they will be able to compare arguments. They will be able to look at conflicting evidence. They'll be able to, or they'll start to think critically about what they're reading in terms of perspectives, sources, etc. And then stage 5 really will start late adolescence. This is more sophisticated assignments in high school, college, and into adulthood, where you are reading really to build knowledge. And so you're picking and choosing what you're reading, you're selecting from multiple sources, you are gathering that information, but then you are constructing, right, your analysis of that, what you think about it, you're building knowledge from that, you're building your own viewpoint about it. It's really learning how to read very strategically so that you are reading for a real purpose and there is a very specific goal, which involves the individual's intent, right? It goes beyond just the directions of an assignment. It's what am I hoping to achieve?
Yeah.
What I love about these stages is that, it has been affirmed over and over again, right? So, of course, the National Reading Panel study, which, compiled an enormous amount of research, hit on their 5 pillars, which were all addressed in Shaw stages. And then more recent research, that has really been looking not only about sort of the decoding process and the nuances of comprehension, but is also looking a lot about sort of how we respond to students where they are, right? How do we meet the needs of readers? That all very much aligns with her work and her developmental stages as well. And I think really importantly, whatever the critics may be right now of aspects, right, that are being promoted, there's certainly folks who feel that phonics instruction creates a lot of rigidity, right? And certainly taken out of context, it's missing a lot of the components of reading, right? Comprehension, reading as a life experience, and so on. And I think ultimately what we're really learning from so much of the research that's coming out now, and also the advocacy work, and just a real movement across the country to improve how we are teaching children how to read and how we really conceptualize literacy instruction, is that nothing is going to be one size fits all, right? So there are practices and strategies and skills that we know must be taught, that students are going to benefit from explicit systematic instruction, but that every reader is coming to reading from where they are, right? And that's important. And these developmental stages can really help us think about that, because students with a reading disability, for example, may spend more time in the early stages of learning how to decode. That might be much more effortful for them. And it doesn't mean that they are deficient when we look at it through a developmental continuum, right? It means that's where they are on the stage, and they need more practice at this particular stage to become proficient as they continue to progress through the later stages. And that's true of readers from all types of profiles and backgrounds. So I think it's just really important that we're always thinking about how can we meet the individual learner. And I think that these developmental stages can really help us with that, because they can help us see where a student is in their progression.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Alexis. I think that explanation was such a comprehensive foundation for our study of reading development, I should say. And I really appreciated how you connected that to instruction and thinking about how we tailor it to individual students. And when we get into episode 4 of our series focused on instruction, we'll be able to really dive into some of the things that you have said and really revisit that. So, I always learn something new from you. Thank you for being on Read.
Thank you for having me.
Alexis just painted such a clear picture. As children grow, they shift from learning to read, which relies on things like decoding words and building fluency, to reading to learn, which draws more heavily on language comprehension. I love this idea. Reading isn't something that we master once and move on. It's a skill that we keep developing and refining throughout our lives. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm still learning to read. This is amazing. And one of the most important threads throughout reading development is language, oral language. That's something that we start developing even before birth. I'm so lucky to be joined by my next guest, Dr. Mindy Bridges. She's the director of the Reading, Language, and Learning Lab at the University of Kansas, one of my research favorites, one of my favorite humans in the world. She's going to join us next to explain how early language skills shape reading and how the process evolves over time. Let's tune in.
Okay, so again, I could talk about language for days, so I'm going to try and be concise as possible. But first, I just want to say talking about language development is one of my favorite things, because it's so amazing if you think about what children from infancy through adolescence and even adulthood, because we're always learning, in enhancing our language skills. What they learn without really being explicitly taught is pretty fantastic. So when we think about language development, there is kind of a natural progression of skills that we expect most children to make naturally. Unlike reading, right, which has to be explicitly taught, we're kind of hardwired to be language learners. We have different languages that we learn, but they're all languages are rule governed, and children pass through certain milestones. Now, those milestones can vary a little bit. If you've ever been at a playground, for instance, and heard preschool parents talking about their kids, and there's lots of comparisons about who's saying 2 words and who's asking questions, there's some variation in what age students can hit these milestones, but there's a general developmental progression, right, of milestones that all kids hit. And what's really cool about that is kids do so many things naturally. So I think about my daughter, and when she was young, I heard comments such as "I ran," or "Mom, I won the game." And we kind of, I think adults often stress about that because that's an error, but actually that child was learning a rule, right? In most cases, in a verb, when you want to talk about it in the past, you put an ed at the end, right? And so the child did that naturally, and then usually they learned without an explicit comment. I might have said to my child, "Oh, you did win," or "Yesterday you won that game." But I never said, "Hey, that's wrong. You don't say win, you say won." But she learned it and picked it up. Most children kind of go through this progression naturally, and it's pretty amazing. So before I get really into talking about how it's related to reading, I want to just quickly go over the 5 components of language. I'm a speech pathologist by background. We learned these components, but I think they really map on to the simple view of reading, which I'll talk about in a minute. We have phonology, and phonology is just how sounds are put together to make words. So how we perceive sounds, how we're able to produce them. We also have morphology, and morphology is looking at how we use the smallest unit of meaning, right? So the ability to put the prefix "un" in front of a word increases your vocabulary without having to do a lot of explicit teaching past that prefix, right? If you know the root word, you can learn lots of other words. Syntax is this how words go together to make a sentence, or a phrase, or a clause. We don't explicitly teach children that to say a question, you have to change the order of words in a sentence. They just learn that naturally. They might do it in error for a while, but then they learn that. We also have semantics, which is really kind of, sometimes we say vocabulary, but semantics is even more than that. It's not just the lexical items, but it's learning how we use words, and also that word use can be flexible, right? You have to know nuances of words. You have to know words have multiple meanings, or you might use a certain word in a certain context or with certain people, right? And then finally, we have pragmatics. And pragmatics is really the social use of language, how we change our language depending on who we're talking to or the point that we want to make. And narrative language, the ability to produce and understand stories, which is very related to later good reading. That's situated right within pragmatic skills. So what's really cool about all of these component skills is they map onto what we call the simple view of reading framework. And the simple view of reading framework, I'm sure it's not new to this audience, but I'm just going to say it anyway.
Appreciate that.
It's basically a framework that says that successful or good reading comprehension is a product of decoding, both accurately and fluently, and good listening or language comprehension. And oral language sits right within that language comprehension piece. All of those things that I just mentioned, vocabulary for sure, that's probably the one that has received the most attention with educators, but syntax, even pragmatics, narrative language, all of these skills are early predictors of later reading ability, reading comprehension. And why that's cool is a couple of things. One, I think in the past, before we really started thinking about language, we kind of waited until kids were decoding to really think about doing things that might be helpful for later reading. But language is something we can do all the time, right? Children learn language through, from infancy, by the way. I used to walk around the kitchen and talk to my daughter when she was not even 1. I'm putting the dishes away. I'm doing this. I think my husband and other people thought I was crazy. But we know that all of that, those interactions increase kids' ability to learn language. Um, and all of these things map onto what we need to be able to be an efficient reading comprehender. The other thing that I think is cool is kids can come to their first year of formal schooling, which is usually kindergarten, with kind of a wealth of oral language skills at their fingertips. And they learned these things from interactions with adults, parents, caregivers, aunts, uncles, the babysitter, and also peers, right? So we can do so many really cool language facilitating things, reading stories, but not just reading stories, conversing with kids, giving them an opportunity to talk. I was part of a large kind of multi-site grant where we were kind of teaching teachers to use this language-focused curriculum. And I remember in particular, the preschool teachers were like, oh, I don't know if I can ask my kids to do this. It's going to be so noisy. They're going to talk a lot. And I was like, yes, that's how kids learn language, is to practice, to hear, to talk to their peers. So I think that's why I think language is really important. And I think it's really exciting that in the last decade or two in particular, reading comprehension or language comprehension, oral language ability has really come to the forefront of the science of reading. And people are really understanding how exciting and how important it is to facilitate those skills in kids.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for walking us through that. And for our readers, we're in episode 1. I just want to let you know that language will be a key theme throughout these 4 episodes. Dr. Bridges, we'll have Dr. Kate Kane, on for episode 2. She'll dive further into language and language difficulties. But I just wanted to just highlight that study you were talking about, was the LARC, that both of you are on, as well as Dr. Tiffany Hogan and others, if you want to mention some of your collaborators on that. But can you just tell us just maybe a few takeaways that the research is showing from that LARC study, just again, underscoring this importance of language?
Yeah. So that's the grant that you're talking about was part of the Institute of Education's Reading for Understanding initiative. And I was lucky enough to be a part of a group of people who, by the way, all 4 of the PIs were speech language pathologists by background. So Dr. Hugh Katz, Dr. Shelley Gray, Dr. Laura Justice, and Dr. Tiffany Hogan. So language was huge, right?
Yeah.
And so what we did was really develop, as part of the grant, we also had a part of the grant that just looked at developmental trajectory of kids' language and looked at how that might affect reading. And we found, the early predictors of language, so vocabulary in particular for both multilingual and monolingual students, was a really good predictor of how kids might read in 3rd grade. But we also developed a language-focused curricula for educators to use in the classroom. And the curricula was multifaceted. We know now from research, not just LARC, but others, that really instruction that doesn't just narrowly focus on one thing like vocabulary, but a multifaceted intervention seems to be maybe the most effective, although they're the hardest to study and the hardest to tease apart where you're actually making those effects. But we did find some gains in our preschool through elementary school kids related to vocabulary, related to things like comprehension monitoring. And we also, what I find really exciting, and I don't have explicit necessarily details yet, but anecdotally, because I was the one in the classrooms in our site, teachers were learning so much about how to use language facilitating techniques, and were asking if they could do it in other content area. So, hey, I love how you're teaching vocabulary. Can I use these skills in social sciences, social studies, or can I use these narrative icons? Can I use these in other areas of my class? And yes, please. So those materials are still freely available. And I'm actually in part of a study with Dr. Tiffany Hogan and Shane Piasta, where we're looking at those lessons, but modified for tier 2. So for students who are low language, so not for decoders, but kids who have low language, which means they might be at risk for later reading comprehension. And we're right in the middle of that study. So stay tuned. We're excited to see how that works. But it's been really fun to work with people that are as interested in language as I am. When I started, Danielle, and I would go to conferences as a graduate student 20 years ago, long time ago, I would tell people my background was speech language pathology. And at the time, they would kind of look at me like, why are you at a reading conference?
Right.
And things have, and there not to say there weren't great people doing that work, but it wasn't as common. And now, language is half of what, when you go to a large reading conference, a national or international conference, lots of people are talking about the importance of language and how to modify and help those kids that have low language, which we know is a risk for later poor reading comprehension.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm so happy that I talked to you for episode 1. Our readers cue into the importance of language. And another piece, Dr. Bridges, that you talked about was this multifaceted approach. And we will talk about that as the rest of the episodes unfold, but particularly we'll return to that in episode 4 when we talk about instruction. So, Dr. Bridges, such a joy to learn from you. Thank you so much for joining on the Read podcast.
This has been great. I can't wait to hear all my colleagues talk about their work.
Oh, I love Dr. Bridges. She really captures it. Language development is a journey from, I love this, babbling babies to talkative toddlers to fluent readers. Each stage builds on one before it. And as we've learned, spoken language lays the foundation for reading success. Now, I know many of you are thinking, what about multilingual learners? Children growing up speaking a language other than English and learning to actually read in English in the United States. So to close out this episode, we're turning to Dr. Claude Goldenberg, Namalini and Olivier Professor of Education Emeritus at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Dr. Goldenberg is a leading expert in literacy and multilingual development. He helps us understand what the research tells us about supporting these learners. Let's hear from Dr. Goldenberg. So I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Claude Goldenberg, an expert in the science of reading, and notably, I think the person I turn to the most on research on instruction for English learners. And so I want to highlight or make sure that I highlight the research within the science of reading that attends to diverse learners. And, I've noticed some discourse that may question whether the science of reading actually attends to the needs of multilingual learners. Dr. Goldenberg, would you say that's a fair statement?
I would, Danielle. I mean, with one caveat, which is, I find that invoking the science of reading by itself creates needless acrimony because people talk about it and think they're referring to the same thing, but are not. They pick and choose kind of opportunistically or inadvertently, I don't know. I mean, I prefer to think in terms of reading research or more broadly, literacy research. For some reason, science has become a lightning rod. I mean, which is too bad because the whole point of science is understanding and creating understanding and helping people understand what's going on. So, but with that caveat in mind, yeah, what we call the science of reading, which is research from neurolinguistics, classrooms, behavioral studies, vast areas of research and interdisciplinary research, it applies in general to everyone. Now, there are qualifications and caveats and yes, buts, and in addition to that we'll get into, but that body of knowledge, how people learn to read, what's required to become a reader, how we assist, help, teach, instruct, choose the verb that you like. That's a vast body of knowledge that would help us, educators, help students. And to the extent that we don't pay attention to that, we're doing a great disservice to our students and families and the society in general.
I appreciate that start. I think that's really critical for people to understand. Your research, you're an expert truly in supporting multilingual English learners. And so my first question for you is, what do we know about the reading brain and emergent bilingual students learning to read English in the United States?
Right. Okay, another disclaimer. I'm not a neuroscientist. I make no claim to be. Sometimes I don't know the difference between my earlobe and my prefrontal lobe. One's inside my head and the other one I can see. So everything that I know or think I know, I either thank or accuse people like Marianne Wolf, Stanislaus Dehaene, Ken Pugh, people who are truly scientists who look inside people's heads and try to understand what's going on when they learn to read, when they can't learn to read, when there are difficulties learning to read. And those are my go-to real experts. So what I've done is try to understand that. And what I've seen from the research on that, and it converges with my own personal experience, is that what neuroscientists have concluded or found about what happens when you learn to read and what needs to happen in order to learn to read is perfectly consistent with the behavioral research, the classroom research, and my experience, not just as a researcher, but as a teacher. I came into teaching first grade after I got my PhD. That was my postdoc, teaching first grade. And I came in with a very sort of whole language kind of perspective. This was like back, I don't know, you're probably in kindergarten or something, back in the 80s. And this is the whole language heyday in California. And it sounded about right to me. It's about meaning, 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 and the advice that I got. And it turned out, I actually have a Substack post on this, how some teachers and little kid really taught me what I didn't learn in PhD school. You have to focus on the sounds of the language and their written representation and how they map onto each other. We call that phonics. It's actually much deeper than phonics. It's because the sounds of the language are represented in writing. And if you don't know how the sounds of the language are represented in writing, you cannot read. Now, there's some workarounds for people with visual handicaps and auditory handicaps, but basically that's what needs to happen. And this has been demonstrated, I think, pretty conclusively, or let me be more scientific, consistent with all the data that neuroscientists have produced, that you need that mapping of sounds to the symbols representing those sounds, and then map that to the oral language. And that's what the neuroscientists call the reading circuit. In broad brushstrokes for civilians like me, who don't really fully understand the research, except to the extent that Marianne and Ken and Stanislaus have helped us understand it. So that applies to everyone. Whether you're an English learner, English speaker, Urdu learner, you have to map the sounds of the language that you're learning to read in to how that language is represented in print. And then that connection needs to be connected to the oral language. So what happens for English learners, there's a reason they're called English learners. They're learning English. They're learning English as an additional language. They can map the sounds to the symbols, but if they don't then map that to the oral language, they're not going to be able to read. They can learn to decode. Kids can learn to decode, but you're decoding meaningless symbols. You got to connect it to the oral language, and that's where the reading circuit comes in, which has been confirmed by behavioral research, classroom research, research on phonics, and so forth. Now, we know that there are still challenges and issues. Not everyone learns as easily. Some people learn to read with great difficulty. Other people learn to read very easily. Most of us mortals are somewhere in the middle. But the same basic thing has to happen. For English learners, you got to be providing support in learning the oral language, because that's what they're learning. They're learning the sound system of the language, the phonology, and the semantic system, how the language makes sense, syntactically, morphologically, lexically, all those language. So they're learning, the agenda for them is much tougher, and for the teachers as well. Because if you know the language, all you have to learn, and all in quotation marks, all you have to learn are the sounds and the symbol mapping system, because you already know the language. If you don't know the language, you've got to learn that as well. That's the fundamental difference for English learners.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldenberg. There's so many of those things that I'm going to hold on to. Thank you so much for joining the Read podcast.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Danielle.
Wow. 5 experts, each bringing a unique lens to help us understand the reading brain. And thematically, you can understand how they all fit together. So let's recap what we learned today. Dr. Christodoulou and Dr. Landi teach us that reading isn't natural, it's taught. And our brains have to literally rewire to make it happen. Alexis Pogna walked us through the developmental stages of reading, from sound symbol connections to comprehension and critical thinking. Dr. Bridges highlighted how early language skills support reading and why it matters from the very beginning. She talks about this seminal research, like the simple view of reading, which was first coined by Gow and Tumner, which shows that reading is the product of word reading and language comprehension skills. We'll dive into that in our next few episodes. And then finally, Dr. Goldenberg helped us think critically about multilingual learners and the importance of supporting language and literacy in all forms. This is the start to understanding the decades of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research in reading development, its variability, the instruction, and intervention. And we all know this is relying on one goal, leading to one goal, to improve student outcomes and to prevent and address reading difficulties. In our next episode, we'll explore why some children struggle to learn to read. October is Dyslexia Awareness Month, so it is timely for this topic. Whether you're a parent, a teacher, or just a curious learner like me, you don't want to miss it. So thank you for joining me for this episode of our special Read podcast series, What We Can All Learn About Reading Together. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts, and share this episode with someone who would love to learn alongside us. You can follow the Windward Institute on social media for updates, events, and upcoming speakers. And if you have ideas, questions, or just want to say hi, email us anytime at wi@thewindwardschool.org. Until next time, readers.